The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UWM Center for International Education. Now here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. As the transition to a Trump administration moves forward in the U.S., leaders around the world are calibrating what this unexpected electoral outcome might mean for relations with Washington. With virtually no foreign affairs background, the president-elect presents prognosticators with little to go on. To address this need, we've asked two of our fearless forecasters to look at the possible outlines of Donald Trump's art of the foreign policy deal. John Katzka and Ann Hamilton both served in the U.S. Foreign Service. They appear regularly on our monthly World Affairs Roundup. John, Ann, welcome. Well, what shall we talk about?
How about foreign affairs?
Well, let me start with an observation by The Economist, who said in a recent edition, "It's hard to think of a president-elect less versed in the workings of the world than Mr. Trump, or of one more willing to upturn the global order shaped by America in the 7 decades since the end of the Second World War." So is the global order about to be upturned?
The global order is being upturned. I mean, we have two currents that are flowing right through international relations right now that have already caused some earthquakes and will cause more. And that is in the developed world, in Europe especially. We have an anti-establishment movement that caused Brexit and is gaining strength in a number of countries, most of which have 2017 important elections. And then we have in the developing world an authoritarian stream of consciousness that is not incompatible with what's going on in Europe. It is very much who are we, and what do we want out of relationships? And foreigners in this process are not necessarily included.
So, Ann, what about this? I mean, what about just the U.S.'s ability to sort of shake things up in the way the Economist seems to be concerned about?
Well, a lot of people are predicting a lot of instability in international relations, and I think one of the major issues here is that Trump said a number of times during the campaign, I know we can't necessarily go on what he said in the campaign, but he did state a number of times that he really liked to be unpredictable. And nobody really likes that. I mean, it's one thing to sort of sort through all the things he said he would do, but the fact that he wants to be so unpredictable. Now, whether or not he will depend on a lot of different factors, especially the number of people who he ends up naming to the important post that he has to fill in the next few weeks. But I think that does already put people on edge.
So you've both actually were in Foreign Service in times of transition. Talk a little bit about that process. Like, what's going on right now?
Well, the first one was the most interesting because I expected to see changes. And a year later, there were no changes. And this goes back to a change of political parties where you would think that there would be changes. And having gone through a number of these transitions with a number of presidents for both parties, it is at least 6 months to a year before anything starts to come out of. First of all, there's the vetting process of these candidates, and that's become much more complicated. And then they have to be approved by the Senate. And I'll give you one example. If there was someone who, if Trump was saying, I want to have someone who was going to change our relationships with Russia, and that Secretary of State goes up before the Senate and starts talking about doing that. And there are a number of senators up there, McCain and amongst them who does not want to change the way, the harder line that we're taking vis-a-vis Russia. This can drag the process out. It just will take a lot longer for these candidates to get out there, and then they have to get on the job and figure out where things are. And how this policy, and then they have to come back to the president and tell them how they're seeing this territory. So it's about a year before there's a real change in the policies.
So, from what we know about the makeup of the incoming Senate, is that going to expedite this process in any way? I mean, it's not divided government. He's got a Republican Senate to confirm his nominees.
Well, I think that they will give deference to the appointments that he wants to make, unless there's somebody who's really, really objectionable, and I doubt that he'll do that with candidates that need to be confirmed. But we just don't know. As at this taping, we don't know who he's going to name. He could name Giuliani, who has said he wants to be Secretary of State. We don't know who he'll name for National Security Advisor. Which doesn't need confirmation, so that could, and he could do a lot of decision making through the National Security Council.
There's a precedent there, isn't there?
Of trying to bypass and take all the important appointments. And the National Security Council now has a very large staff, so they can easily bypass the State Department on a lot of different issues. So, and I think that not only is there's the staff issue and the general inertia of bureaucracy and all, but I keep thinking back to, for example, George W. Bush coming in and saying he wanted to focus on domestic issues and people complaining that he had very little foreign policy experience himself. I mean, he had grown up in some foreign countries, but that, he didn't have a lot of foreign policy experience. And then we had 9/11. As I was listening to news reports this morning, people were talking about, they're thinking that ISIS may try and do something to put everybody on notice, either right in the beginning of his administration. I mean, we don't know what will happen, but it could certainly shape a response that we can't predict in any way right now.
I mentioned at the beginning these two currents in the world today that are shaping the way in which we have to adjust to that, as opposed to those currents adjusting to us. And I think that will have a strong bearing in terms of not the people he's going to choose, but in what flexibility they're going to have in terms of dealing with this world. If Europe, if the EU were to collapse, as some have said it already has, and I think that's premature, that changes the dynamic significantly. The EU is now talking about establishing their own military force. Because as NATO, because of some of the statements said during the campaign, is NATO in danger?
Well, let's talk a little bit about sort of what we know or what we can try to divine about Mr. Trump's predilections on foreign affairs. There are a number of sort of continuum. We can look at realist versus idealist, isolationist versus interventionist. Is there any way of placing him on those kinds of continuums?
Well, Ann is the fearless forecaster.
Please. I think he's a pragmatist. We were talking about this earlier, and that's what President Obama said too. He said he doesn't have a consistent ideology, except that he seems to put the primacy of economics over politics, because whatever is good for business is what he's going to promote, and that isn't really the basis for a really sound foreign policy. You have to take geopolitical issues into consideration. I think he's going to find that there are just so many contradictions in the kinds of he's talking about hitting, being hard on China, but then how he needs China to put pressure on the North Koreans with their nuclear program, and there are just so many different trade-offs which none of his remarks seem to have taken into account, and it makes it really hard to figure out which side he's going to come down on.
He has also said an awful lot of things about what he wants to do domestically. And if I could be a fearless forecaster for a second, I would see the easier way for him to proceed is from his strength, which would be much more domestically oriented in the infrastructure questions he's been raising and wanting to deal with.
Well, there's been a few sort of signature issues on the campaign trail. One, of course, being trade. And the transition team has released a memo saying there are 5 main principles in their trade policy, which include renegotiating or withdrawing from NAFTA, stopping the Trans-Pacific Partnership, stopping unfair imports, ending unfair trade practices, and pursuing bilateral trade deals rather than sort of these larger things. So, first of all, is this a possibility? I mean, can we effectively say TPP is dead at this point?
You know, TPP to me is always a political, not an economic tool, and its attraction was the ability of putting together a consortium of interested countries in Asia, excluding China, so that it would be a way in which to be able to a building block in terms of a network of countries to deal with China's rising expectations within the Asian theater.
And what about NAFTA? I mean, you think that's a realistic option at this point? Just walking away if President Trump decides that's in the country's best interest?
Well, he can do it. But again, you have all these different trade-offs, all the spin-offs that are going to happen. The supply chains now are completely they're linked between the 3 countries, and to do that would lead to all sorts of effects that I think they'd have to take into account before he just on day one decided to walk away from NAFTA. And then there are the linkages with the other issues as well. We have a lot of different issues with Mexico. It's not just trade, and trade is usually sort of more of a carrot than a stick. And here he's starting to use trade as the stick, and that's not. It won't necessarily. It could lead to some trade wars that could end up costing a lot of. I don't know with Mexico necessarily, but certainly with China, and could end up costing a lot of American jobs ultimately.
I would look to some of the things he said about Obamacare as maybe a way in which he is becoming more nuanced in terms of how he looks at these issues. And one question on 60 Minutes, he said, well, this part is fine, we should keep that, and this part is fine. Although what parents want to keep their 26-year-olds at home, but that was kind of a more nuanced approach. I think we should forget what was said during the campaign, because I don't think it's instructive. I think if you're in the opposition, it's warm and cuddly to be able to call this stuff up and say what kind of a jerk the guy is. But in terms of looking ahead as to what might be happening, I think the things he says from now on, and as I say, this more nuanced approach that he has had on healthcare may also be the way in which he deals with these trade agreements as well.
I heard somebody, his last name is Wright, he's at the Brookings Institution, talk about, he had studied Donald Trump's policies since 1987, I think, when came out strongly because he was upset about Japan's economic rise and power and all. He came up with 3 constants dating back to 1987, and so sort of to try to remove it from the campaign itself and look at sort of his core beliefs. And one of them was, that is a suspicion of trade agreements, that in theory he thought they were okay, but strong suspicion against trade agreements. Another one was suspicion of alliances, and especially always wanting our allies to be paying their fair share, which he's complained about for a very long time, and then a predilection for very strong government, which you could read as authoritarian government. So I don't know whether it's. I think it is good to stand back from what he said in the campaign, because a lot of that was in the heat of the moment, and obviously to win votes and all. But I think that he does have some core beliefs that have been consistent over time that I think will show up in some way. It's just hard to know how they will, given all the trade-offs.
Well, we can work our way down the list of other big issues likely to be in the presidential inbox, but first we'll take a short break. We'll be right back.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back. We're talking with John Katzka and Ann Hamilton, who are sketching out the outlines of the Trump administration's foreign policy. So another signature issue during the campaign, of course, was immigration. And sort of the most extravagant claim was 11 million people would be rounded up and deported. And now that's been modified somewhat. What's the current message coming out of the transition team?
They're talking about some 3 million people who have criminal records, who are here illegally and have criminal records, who they say they will deport right away. So the number is an estimate, and obviously, and it would obviously put a strain on. I mean, not only would it be politically controversial, even deporting 3 million people, but it would put a strain on the resources of the Department of Justice and ICE and other entities that would be involved.
There are still due process issues, are there not? I mean, even for those who have criminal records, you can't just summarily round them up and chuck them over the border, can you? I mean, there still is a process involved to actually get them out, isn't there?
Yes, and that's why it would cost a lot of money.
That's
and you know, the resources just aren't there. They have a hard time processing all the immigration cases that they're actively processing right now, many of which involve possible deportation.
It'll be interesting to watch whether this threat slows the flow of illegal immigrants into the country or not.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and to that point, the wall seems to be becoming something a bit less than a wall. Now there's House Republicans talking much more about border security rather than this impermeable edifice. So.
Well, there is a difference between what House Republicans are talking about and what Donald Trump may be talking about. And there will be interesting times between these two, because as anyone who is watching this is aware, it wasn't a complete chorus there singing the same music through this campaign and through this election. And so, yes, the Republican House and Senate is coming back closer to the president-elect, but there are going to be issues where they're not going to be singing the same song.
Well, one of the building blocks of that post-World War II order that we referenced at the outset is NATO. And as we're recording this show, President Obama is in Greece trying to reassure the Europeans that NATO is a going concern and not likely to be unraveled anytime soon. What do we know so far about the incoming Trump administration's feelings on NATO?
Well, he definitely wants the other members of NATO to pay more for the alliance. I mean, I think that's pretty sure, and I think he will press for that. And I think it's interesting because just because we all agree that we can't sort of take what he said during the campaign as evidence of what he's going to do, I don't think we can take what he said to Obama in the first meeting at the White House or what Obama is saying now as real evidence. I mean, Obama is trying to calm nerves, I think, and also look very presidential. And Donald Trump knew when he was elected, which obviously was evidently a surprise to him, as it was to many people, that he had to come out and look very presidential. And so he also was trying to do the same thing. And I don't really know how much we can take from that. So while he said, he's walked back from his statements about NATO, I do think it's very clear that he is going to try and get them to pay a lot more. And I don't know what that will do to the alliance, because they don't exactly have extra, all these countries have extra cash hanging around.
Yes. I think we should recognize that the reason we want NATO is for our ability then to be involved in European affairs. And the Europeans, and in fact, I mentioned earlier that they're talking about creating their own defense force. The Europeans aren't always happy with the way in which we direct NATO, and because we have gotten them into areas that, like Afghanistan and Iraq, where they weren't excited to go. I mean, they didn't see their national interest in that.
And in fact, that's one of the areas that Donald Trump has suggested would make NATO of more use, to take a more firm anti-terrorism sort of route. So.
Yes, there you are.
Well, certainly related to NATO is the U.S. relationship with Russia. So Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin had what was reportedly a warm and cordial conversation this week. Talk a little bit about that and where that may take us.
Well, the Russians' take on it was, we want to see action, not just words on this process. And if you will go back 8 years to a little red button that was sat on the table, that the current president said, I'm going to reorder our relationship with Russia. Well, when he called for the reordering of the relationship, he didn't stop attempting to try and bring Ukraine and Georgia into closer relationships with NATO and with the EU. And so therefore that irritant in terms of the relationship didn't go away and only got worse.
And is it likely to be resolved now?
It depends upon what we're going to do about NATO expansion.
And also, I mean, the Russians clearly would like us to lift sanctions, and then you've got Congress involved there as well. So
he has some sanctions he can remove by himself, I'm told.
Okay.
But significantly, after the conversation, Mr. Putin said the basis of the new warm relationship would in part rest on non-interference in domestic affairs. So how does Russia see domestic affairs? I would think a bit more expansively than Washington has traditionally.
Well, I talked to a group of Cedarburg High School students this morning about this very topic, and my conclusion is that Russia will not allow Ukraine to become part of NATO. That is a issue that they will. That's the sword that'll have to fall on that one, and it's up to us to decide how we're going to deal with that issue. I mean, we can say we're going to pursue this, and to what extent, at what cost, and what consequences. I mean, do we want to have a relationship with Russia? And forget about Syria on this thing, because that was a Russian attempt to draw attention away from what was going on in Ukraine and to drag us into and show that they were a bigger player than we were prepared to say they were. I'm not sure where we're going on this. I think his initial instincts are to back off of the confrontation, but there is a Senate that is much stronger and much more radically oriented on this subject.
Well, there's another very key relationship as we are winding down our time here that we certainly need to get to, and that's China. One of the things that Donald Trump has said is he would name China as a currency manipulator on day one. Now, first of all, is that factually accurate? I mean, I think there are economists who say, if anything, they're trying to prop up the yuan these days, and
Right. I don't actually know if it's factually accurate, but I think that, and he's also said that he would put 45% tariffs on certain Chinese imports and all sorts of other things. I haven't heard him talk very much about the South China Sea, though. Have you heard about that?
No, not at all.
And that's a major issue, obviously, of great concern to the U.S., freedom of navigation, and also the territorial claims that they're making there. So he's it's unclear. He seems to have been really concerned about China and trade, but not the other aspects of the relationship.
Well, and significantly, should it come to a traditional trade war, Alibaba, the retail giant in China, recently had its Singles Day for 11/11, November 11th, which they're really trying to hype sales. And the total take for the day was $18 billion.
Wow.
Last Black Friday in the U.S. was $12 billion. So I don't know if they're quite as beholden to us for trade as the Trump administration may hope.
Well, we do have, we have been relying on Chinese money to prop up our economy for a number of years. And how this affects that dialogue, Saudi Arabia is another case in point, which having heavy investments in the U.S. economy. But where is this going forward? I mean, does China have an alternative to where a place to put its money? And as Saudi Arabia does, has the same issue.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. I don't know how much light we were able to shed on the future, but we made a good effort at it in any case, and stay tuned.
Does anyone have a flashlight?
John Katzka, Ann Hamilton, thank you as always. To our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
Fearless hand.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,